Center, what we do. And what we are is a digital library. And our purpose or our mission is to collect everything about Theodore Roosevelt. Maybe it's letters he wrote, letters he received, photographs taken of Theodore Roosevelt, maybe photographs of important people during his time period, photographs of his family. We also have film clips of his inauguration. We have film clips of him walking around his home in Sagamore Hill. We have postcards. We have newspaper articles. We have everything you can imagine that is related to Theodore Roosevelt we have in our library. We also have something called ephemera. And ephemera means that any little thing that has Theodore Roosevelt's picture or his name on it, we have in our digital library. And what we do is we take pictures or we scan these documents, we categorize them in different groups, we catalog them, and we give them a description, and we also put tags on them. So if you, no matter where you're at, whether you're at home or you're at school, you're on the East Coast, you're on the West Coast, you can go to our site and we'll have all this information ready for you. And we're a reliable source. We've looked through this information, we've had historians look at this information, so you know it's a good source of information. Now, you might be wondering, what is the connection between Theodore Roosevelt, who spent the majority of his time on the East Coast, who was born in New York, with North Dakota? Now, raise your hands. Have any of you visited North Dakota? I see no hands. No hands. Okay. Well, the reason that we have a connection with Theodore Roosevelt was in 1848, Theodore Roosevelt came to North Dakota to kill a bison. That was on his list of what he wanted to shoot. So he went to North Dakota to shoot a bison, and while he was there, before he left, he bought a cattle ranch. And if you look at the picture on the bottom, there's that little tiny gray picture of a ranch, of a house. That is his Maltese Cross Ranch. That was his first ranch that he bought. And for the next 3 years, he would spend time on and off of that ranch. He would eventually move to the second ranch, which is on top, which is called the Elkhorn Ranch. And if you look at all the bones and or the antlers, those are the elk horns, the way it got its name. And what happened was in 1884, Theodore Roosevelt lost an election, one of his first elections, and on February 14th, and if you look at the diary entry on that picture there with the big X, his wife, who had just given birth, and his mother on Valentine's Day would die within hours of each other. He was devastated. He had just lost this election. He lost two very, very important people that were very close to him, and he really didn't know what to do. So he went to his cattle ranch in North Dakota to try to deal with the grief and try to get his bearings as to what should be his next step. And while he was in North Dakota, he was a true cowboy. He rounded up cattle, he rode horses from day till night, and in the case of the picture up on the top, he actually captured boat thieves. These three men had stolen one of his boats. He and two of his employees went down, they caught the men, and Theodore Roosevelt actually took the men, walked well over 40 miles on foot to take these men from the Missouri River to Dickinson, North Dakota, to take them to jail. And so he's had this connection with North Dakota. He's actually stated as saying that if he hadn't spent the time in North Dakota, he never would have been president of the United States. He would continue to make friends, stay in contact with his friends in North Dakota, and he would continue to have the ranch until 1898 when he would finally sell it. So that's the connection between Theodore Roosevelt and North Dakota. Now, before we get started on this, we are going to be looking at primary source documents. And primary source documents are pictures, they are letters, they're all kinds of documents, they might be photographs that are from the time period. And so you need to look at these as historians and remember and in this case, the documents that we're looking at are over 135 years old, that what we're going to see, some of the stereotypes, some of the language used, might be appalling to us. They are not acceptable for us to be using at this time period. But 135 years ago, they were mainstream. It was in their media, it was in their literature, it was in their newspapers. So I just really want you to keep this in mind as we're going through this, that you're going to come across some stereotypes that aren't acceptable now, but were acceptable then, and we're going to come across those. So please keep that in mind as we go through some of these documents. Now the first, can anybody tell me, what is this a picture of?
Statue of Liberty.
The Statue of Liberty. Raise your hands. Has anybody been to the Statue of Liberty? All right. I myself have not been at the Statue of Liberty, but at the base of the Statue of Liberty is the poem called the New Colossus. And I'm going to read the New Colossus to you because it really is the basis and the belief of what immigration should be in the United States. It states, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door," by Emma Lazarus. Now this poem was written in 1883, and again, it's become the belief of our time period and of the United States that we're the melting pot, that we accepted all immigrants into the United States. But we're going to look at an immigration policy that really counteracts that belief. And so we're going to question, has the U.S. always had an open door for immigrants? Have we always welcomed them? Has that door been open to everyone? Have we always welcomed all types of immigrants? And will that door continue to be open for all immigrants? Now, when I talk about stereotypes, this is what I was talking about. This is a political cartoon that is from, I do believe, 1990. And I want you to look at it closely. When you're looking at cartoons, there's a lot of information in cartoons. And can somebody tell me, who are the two main characters that you see in this cartoon? You can just shout out the answer. Who are the two main characters?
A Native American and a Pilgrim.
Okay, a Native American and Pilgrim. And when we talked about this, when we talked about the stereotypes, this is an example of a stereotype of a Native American and a Pilgrim. And if you look in the pocket of our Pilgrim, we know he's a Pilgrim by the way he looks, and also there's the date of AD 1620, and that's when the Pilgrims landed. Now, what objects do we see? What is the Native American holding in his hand? What does it look like? What is that? Did you say a stick? I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Elemental doesn't say out loud. Peace tree, what else? Decoration.
I did.
A peace treaty.
Okay, he's got a tree. There's a piece. He's got a stick, but he's got some paper written around it. There's some paper, and actually, what that is in relation to immigration. And it looks like he is going to hit the Pilgrim. And on the right-hand side is the caption. And here's the caption to this cartoon. "Where would we be if the real Americans had held Lodge's view of immigration? There would be no Lodge bill now, nor anything else." The Pilgrim is being portrayed as Henry Cabot Lodge, and he was a proponent. He believed in restrictions to immigration. So what do you think this cartoonist, what message is he trying to show with this cartoon about immigration?
That there shouldn't be any laws to immigration.
There shouldn't be any laws towards immigration. There you go. Very good. Now, this next one that I'm going to show you shows a lot of stereotypes. a lot of stereotypes. And the caption on the bottom says, "How John May Dodge the Exclusion Act." A derogatory term that was used towards the Chinese immigrants was that they called them John Chinamen. And you're going to see them depicted as having the long braid down their back and in loose-fitting clothes. And we're going to see this portrayed quite a few times in the political cartoons that I'm going to be covering. And so in the very center, what is happening to the Chinese immigrant? Yes? What's happening to the Chinese immigrant in the very center of this cartoon?
They're getting kicked out.
They're getting kicked out. And who's kicking them out? Can you tell? Who do you think that might be?
The Americans.
The Americans. Have you ever seen pictures of Uncle Sam? He's got striped pants, and that would be looking like the leg of Uncle Sam, and he's kicking out the Chinese immigrant. Now they're saying that he's not allowed, but look at all of the different immigrants that are being allowed. In the one corner we have, "If not these, let him come to us as a cup challenger." So a British citizen, a British immigrant that might be in competition with the United States in sailing. And the other one, as an industrious anarchist, for example. There was an anarchist movement. The majority of the anarchists were Russians, and they were using bombs to blow up areas in the United States. They were being allowed in the United States, but not the Chinese immigrants. Or maybe the immigrant should disguise themselves as a humble Irishman. Or maybe, and it says on here, let him come as an English wife hunter. There was a trend for poor English nobles who had no money to come to the United States, and what they would do is marry young American women who had lots of money and really wanted a title. And at the very bottom, or a peaceful, law-abiding Sicilian. And if you look closely at that picture, he's holding a gun and a knife. So I don't know exactly how law-abiding and peaceful he is. So what is this message this particular cartoonist is saying about immigration and the Chinese immigrants?
What are they saying? So yeah, why not them?
Why them?
Exactly. Exactly. Why are they blocking them when you're allowing all these other immigrants who, in some views, might not be the best? Let's look at another cartoon. And we've got some activity going on in here. And in the very back, you are going to see that there's a wall being torn down. And at that time period, China had been pretty secluded. There had not been a lot of trade, and there really wasn't a lot known about China. And they were very mysterious. And all of a sudden, their wall is coming down. There's more trade. You'll look and see that there's a ship in the background, and they're loading tea on it. There's more trade. There's more travel going on between the United States and China. And you have a large group of people coming over to the United States. Now, what activity is taking place at the very front of this picture? What are the people doing? What are they doing?
They're building a wall.
They're building a wall. This group of characters or immigrants are building a wall. And they're building a wall to keep out the Chinese. And if you look closely, each one of those bricks that they're using has some different wording on it. And they've got bricks that say jealousy, competition, laws against race, congressional blunders, anti-low wages, un-American, non-reciprocity, fear, anti-low wages. I think I repeated that one. So they're using all of this as an example of what's building this wall. And at the very bottom, you have what's sticking all of these ideas, these fears together is congressional mortar, which would be laws. And who's putting this wall together? Who do you think is being portrayed as the one putting that mortar together?
It says English.
He's got a long beard.
What's his
Uncle Sam.
Uncle Sam. So we have Uncle Sam is helping build this wall to block the Chinese. Now there's some factors that contributed to this Chinese Exclusion Act. And let's look at some of those. One of the first factors was you ended up with an increase of Chinese immigrants. Now, here's some numbers for you. In 1848, there were recorded 325 Chinese immigrants. Pretty small number. How many students are in your school? Do you have an idea?
About 300.
At the middle school.
At the middle school.
At the middle school? Okay, so that would be about all of your middle school going to a different country. So that's the first number. In 1849, the number doubles, almost doubles, and it's 648 immigrants. In 1850, the number goes to 1,098 immigrants. In 1852, the number of immigrants grows to 25,000 immigrants. In one day alone, 2,000 immigrants come to the United States. The numbers expand, they just blow up. So you have this huge, huge group of Chinese immigrants coming in. Now, why did they? What made the Chinese get into a ship or into a boat and come to the United States? Well, some of the reasons were their country at the time period. They had gone through years of rebellion, wars, economic downturns, and they had nothing. There were no jobs, they had no opportunities, and they really didn't have a chance to make a living and support their families and support themselves. In 1849, what else was taking place in the United States? Do you know? If you look at the second line, you can kind of get a hint. What's taking place in the United States?
The gold rush.
The gold rush. All of a sudden, you have this gold rush, and everyone from the United States is coming, everyone from other countries are coming, and California becomes, in China, they call it the Gold Mountain. And you have these stories about just picking up handfuls of gold in California and becoming rich and being able to support yourself. And it was so easy to get so rich. And just like everyone else from the United States, you had the Chinese coming over. They had no opportunities where they were, so they came over to the United States. And the gold rush really pushed a lot of those people over, the Chinese over. Also, we had the Transcontinental Railroad. You had other mines, like coal mines, taking place, and you needed people to work on farms. You had needed help in the fisheries, the canneries, and so there was a need for workers. And the United States in the beginning opened their arms. They needed the workers. The industrials needed the workers. And in fact, in California, the governor was stated as saying that he believed the Celestials, they call them Celestials, he believed that within a year, they would have the right to vote even. And so they were really welcomed. But they were kept at arm's length. They could come to the mines, to the gold fields, but they could only work in mines that had already been mined and abandoned. They couldn't live in the same cities and towns and villages of other American citizens. I live in North Dakota. In South Dakota, Deadwood, South Dakota, they had a small gold rush, and the Chinese actually lived in tunnels underneath the city because they were not allowed above the street at night. So even though they were accepted for their work, they were still kept at arm's length. They still kept them kind of out of reach. So the gold rush takes place, but then for every boom, you've got a bust. And all of a sudden, everyone's there to make gold, everyone's to try to get rich, and it busts, and nobody's rich. You have all of these people in California. They're all trying to get jobs. They're all trying to make a living, and there's just so many people. And also, you have the economy taking a downturn. There were fewer jobs, and the Chinese workers would be paid less, and so then the wages also went down. The Chinese were also contracted by the labor unions had started to come up, and if there was a strike for the labor unions saying we want better working conditions, we only want to work 10 hours instead of a 12-hour day, we would like to get paid better, the owners would say, we're going to bring in Chinese workers and you're all lost your jobs. And that was a very common practice. They would sometimes contract in anywhere from 500 to over 1,000 Chinese immigrants to come in. And all of those, so over 1,000 people would lose their jobs. So there was a lot of discrimination, there was a lot of hatred starting to build up against the Chinese. The railroad itself, when they hired the employees, if you look on the right-hand side of the pictures, you'll see the railroad employees, and over 90% of the railroad employees were the Chinese. And they were literally paid 10 cents to the dollar of other employees. They were also, the room and board were not paid. They had to come up with their own. And they were considered dispensable. So they were given the jobs that were most dangerous. They were lowered on baskets on the sides of mountains with explosives to blow away the mountain or to build tunnels. The mortality rate was incredibly high for the Chinese immigrants that worked in the Transcontinental Railroad. So we have all of this going on. You have a lot of Chinese. They appear to be taking jobs from other Americans, and you have a lot of resentment going. And you have a man called Dennis Kearney. For the majority of the time, this is all taking place only in California. And the labor unions are getting bigger and bigger, and you have the Workingmen's Party of California, and Dennis Kearney gets involved. And their motto was, the Chinese must go. And they talked about, they said, they aren't like us. They work for less, which causes whites to work for less or lose their jobs. They tried to start so that businesses would fire their Chinese employees, and they also pushed for people not to buy anything that was made from the Chinese or have Chinese work for them. Like, for example, if they had a laundry, they would say, don't use the Chinese laundries. They did everything they could to try to block the Chinese. He used a lot of inflammatory rhetoric when he talked about this, which caused a lot of rioting. They set fire to Chinese businesses, and there was lynchings. They killed some of the Chinese immigrants, and it became very, very violent. What Kearney did in the Workingmen's Party, California itself as a state had tried to block some of the Chinese immigrants from coming in, but they could not, states cannot control immigration. Only the federal government could. And so the federal government finally, Kearney and his group, made it become a nationwide problem instead of just for the state. Another issue that contributed to the Chinese Exclusion Act was something called nativist. And a nativist is someone who has an intense opposition to a minority that they consider foreign. And in this case, this foreign would be someone that's un-American. It doesn't have American values. And Senator James Blaine, he is from Maine, this is how he described the Chinese. He stated that they were vicious, they were dangerous, and they were un-American. Now, have you ever heard of the name Ralph Waldo Emerson? Have you ever read any of his poetry, any of his essays? Names sound slightly familiar? American writer. And as I did my research, I was surprised to hear him describe the Chinese as this. He said that their civilization was a besotted perversity. And he said that the people were they were cheerless and stupid. So this discrimination towards the Chinese for being different was widespread. Also, the assimilation for the Chinese to assimilate and to become part of the American tradition and society was difficult for them. First of all, only men came over. There were very few Chinese women that came over. One was because they were blocked by different restrictions. Also, the men came over as temporary workers. Their thought was that they would come over to the United States, they would make their fortune, they would send their money back home, and then they would return to China. In fact, in a lot of the cases, if a Chinese immigrant were to die in the United States, part of their contracts would be that their bones would be returned to be buried in China. In Deadwood's Mount Moriah Cemetery, their Chinese cemetery actually has empty graves because the bodies were returned to China. So they were temporary workers, and they looked different. Now, if you look at the pictures, they have their heads are shaved in the front, and they've got a long braid down the back. And it wasn't a fad. It wasn't a hairstyle. They were forced to do that. During the different rebellions that they had, there was one rebellion called the Quinn Rebellion, and when they won, they forced the people that fought against them, the men, to wear their hair that way. That was a form of loyalty to the new rulers, subservience to the new rulers. And if they were caught without that braid, they were executed. So if these workers, these Chinese immigrants, came to the United States and their braid was cut off by someone, or they cut it off to try to fit in, and then tried to return to the United States, they literally could lose their life over it. So they were different, but it really was a life and death matter for them. They also had different beliefs. They had a different religion. They spoke a different language with many dialects, and they ate different foods. They were very, very foreign, and in this case, the majority of Americans saw foreign as un-American. Different was un-American, and this led to the Chinese Exclusion Act. Here's a very common image that would have been shown during this time period, and it was comparing the workers, the Chinese workers, to the American workers. And on the bottom, it's very blurry, but it says why they can live on 40 cents a day and why he cannot. And if you look at the image, they have, and I tried to count all the different people in here, and I think there's about 10 to 12 Chinese immigrants in one room. And can you tell what they look like they're eating? Rats. They constantly were seen or depicted as eating rats. And then you have the American worker on the other side who's coming home. It says, God bless our home on the door. He's coming home to his 3 children, his wife, a little kitty cat. So this image was very common to show the difference between the two workers. Now, the Chinese Exclusion Act itself is quite long. It is 49 sections long, and we're not going to cover all of those. We do not have enough time in the day to cover all of these. So we're just going to go over a few of them. The very first one shows exactly what the Chinese Exclusion Act was. It says all Chinese refused admission except natives, citizens, officials, teachers, students, merchants, travelers, returning laborers, and returning domiciled merchants. Because remember, it's been 40-some years, and the Chinese have been coming all of this time. So there's some that have been here for 40-plus years. And so those people were accepted. They could come in through the United States. The rest could not. And anybody that was considered a laborer or the potential for a laborer, they were blocked. They could not come into the United States. Declares bringing or attempting, conspiring, or plotting to bring into the United States Chinese other than those mentioned in Section 1 is a misdemeanor. Human smuggling through Canada and through Mexico was widespread. The Canadian government allowed Chinese to disembark on their shores, but they were to be put immediately on trains that took them to the United States. If they got off the train in China, they had a head tax put on them. And the tax ranged anywhere from $50 per person to $500 per person if they got off that train. So there was a lot of smuggling that took place to try to get the Chinese into the United States. Certification is needed from the exempted classes, even if just crossing the U.S. to another country. So for example, you are a student or a teacher, and you are going to go from California, you're going to land in California, you're just going to travel through the states to Europe on the other side. You had to have certification, you had to have paperwork to prove that you were just crossing through. Otherwise, you would be deported and you would be blocked from entering into the United States. And further provides that Chinese claiming right of admission based on birth must have the testimony of at least one credible white witness and production of record of birth. So a native would be someone, and this is the policy of the United States, that if you were born in the United States, you were an American citizen. And that was the same case for Chinese citizens. If they did come over here, they were born in the United States, they were an American citizen, or a citizen, a native. But you had to have a record of your birth, which would be a birth certificate. And raise your hand if you have a birth certificate. Oh yeah, everybody should have a birth certificate. But in this day and age, they weren't that common. And the only way you could prove that you had been born in the United States was if a white person stood up for you and said that you had been born there. Maybe they had witnessed your birth. The last one that we're going to talk about the Exclusion Act, is pretty severe. It says, provides against the naturalization of Chinese. And what this means is that the Chinese would never, ever become citizens of the United States. If you came over as an immigrant, you were never given the opportunity to become a citizen of the United States. No matter what your job, no matter what you had been doing, nothing. You would never, ever become a citizen of the United States. Now, I said that there is a lot, as I started doing the research for this, there's a lot of immigration, a lot of laws, there's a lot of rules, and this is a partial list of some of the laws and immigration acts that followed the Chinese Exclusion Act and just dealt with the Chinese. There were other acts taking place that dealt with other racial groups, that dealt with other situations. These were the only ones that dealt with strictly the Chinese. And the Chinese Exclusion Act was the most restrictive, and it actually was the first immigration act that secluded people, banned people based entirely on your race. It didn't matter. Up until then, sometimes you would lose your citizenship if you would not be allowed in, if you were sick, or if you were a criminal. This was the only case that if you came in and you were of a certain race, you would not be allowed in. The Scott Act of 1888 opened up so that not only were the Chinese secluded and restricted, but it opened it up so that more Asian countries were also blocked. So it just broadened that exclusion to other groups. The Act of 1889 made it so that Chinese men could not marry an American woman or a white woman. It blocked that type of marriage. The Immigration Act of the Geary Act of 1892 made the Exclusion Act permanent. It was to never go away, ever, ever, ever go away. And it also required all Chinese residents, people that actually had lived there, to carry a card. And on this card, it had to have their picture, and it had to have their information, because Senator Geary, he believed that all Chinese people looked the same, and if they didn't have this card, you couldn't tell them apart. Remember when we talked about stereotypes and how sometimes those are appalling to us now? This is an example. Also, Chinese people, the immigrants, were not allowed to testify in court. If a Chinese immigrant had saw someone murder someone, So look around the people that are in your class or that are in this group. Let's say the boy in the red sweatshirt, you just saw him murder somebody. And you're Chinese.
I can see that too.
He would get away with murder because you could not testify against him. That's what the act said. Is that right? Do you think that's right? Raise your hand if you think that's right. I'm glad to see there are no hands raised. Thank you. So that's one of the laws that happened during this act. Another thing that took place was the Immigration Act of 1906. And this one, notice it's in parentheses, and that's because it really didn't affect the Chinese, but it might be one that you're starting to see now in the headlines. And what this was is that Theodore Roosevelt and the government stated that the only way you could become a citizen of the United States was if you spoke English. If you couldn't speak English, you couldn't be a citizen of the United States. And you might be seeing that one around. The Immigration Act of 1917 said that, let's see here, banned immigration from almost all Chinese countries and all Asian countries. Again, this exclusion just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It just started blocking more and more groups, and they were only based on their race. They could be the greatest people in the world, but because they were Chinese, they blocked them.
Local date March 15, 2017. Correspondence direction nothing. Student.
Pardon? Okay. The Johnson-Reed Act put a quota system on it, and that managed to block all residents of Chinese government or the Chinese and Asian countries from coming in, and it also blocked all Arabic countries. So with that act, all Arabic countries and all Chinese and Asian countries, no immigrants were allowed. The Cable Act of 1922 said that if you were an American woman and you married a Chinese man, you lost your citizenship. They took it away from you. It isn't until 1943, so look, 1882 all the way to 1943, the Magnuson Act finally repeals the Chinese Exclusion Act. Chinese immigrants are finally allowed to come into the United States. They are finally allowed to become citizens of the United States. But they only allow 105 Chinese immigrants a year. So they allow them in, but they're very, very limited. Now, what was Theodore Roosevelt's view on this exclusion? This did take place, it had started, but it did take place during his presidency. And this is a letter Theodore Roosevelt wrote to George Colossus, who was Secretary of Commerce and Labor. And all immigration took place and was situated under Commerce and Labor. This would be 2 years after the Chinese Exclusion Act was made permanent. So listen to this and decide if Theodore Roosevelt supported or believed in this act. The policy of the law is to favor merchants and students. The severe restrictions around the law are for the purpose of preventing imposition by which Chinese laborers will come here under pretense of being students or merchants. I have been for a long time uneasy about the way in which Chinese merchants and Chinese students have all kinds of obstacles thrown in their way when they come to this country. I think it is serious damage to our people when this is the case. We wish to enlarge our trade with China. We wish to make ever firmer our intellectual hold upon China. It is for our interest that Chinese merchants should come here and that Chinese students should come here. It is very much against our interest that Chinese laborers should come here and compete with their own workmen. Everything should be done to prevent the latter coming in by any fraud or evasion, but we should at the same time do everything to prevent harshness being done to the merchant and the students. So as you look at this and as you listen to this, he supported the Chinese Exclusion Act. He believed that the laborers needed to be kept out of the United States because it was a detriment to the workers already within the United States. And that is a very viable and very important reason. Now, the reason that he supported that the Chinese students and the merchants continue is that he wanted trade with China. He wanted an intellectual hold on China. He wanted to spread the information or the philosophies of the United States and democracy. So it's a two ideas that he has here. Protect the workmen, but then also spread the views of our government. That he did support the Chinese Exclusion Act. We have another image. This is another political cartoon, and like I said, with political cartoons, there's a lot going on. And in this particular one, we've got some symbols. Off to the left, we have the American flag with the rainbow, and it says liberty. You also have this big storm that shows prejudice, and you have this ship rocking on this very stormy sea. And this sailor lifeguard, who is portrayed as Roosevelt, is sending out a lifeline that says tolerance. And this quote comes from a reference that he made to immigrants. I feel that we should be peculiarly watchful over them because of our own history, because we or our fathers came here under like conditions. Now that we have established ourselves, let us see to it that we stretch out the hand of help, the hand of brotherhood, towards the newcomers, and help them as speedily as possible to shape themselves and get into such relations that it will be easy for them to walk well in the new life. So just as he was against the laborers coming in and interfering with the workmen, he did appear, and he did state in this comment, that he did welcome the immigrants, but he wanted them to be successful in this new life in the United States. There were many, and these documents again come from our digital library. There are many who did not, or who supported the Chinese Exclusion Act. And as I go through this, I want you to look at their reasonings. Do they have valid reasons for not wanting the Chinese immigrants to come in? The first letter is from Irvin Wardman, and he is an editor of the New York Press. And this is what he states about the Chinese immigration. Every railroad, every mill, every factory, and every industrial concern in this country is now cutting down its force of employees. They are going out by the tens of thousands, and no man can say how many hundreds of thousands will be out of work by next election. Meanwhile, the tide of immigration flows in on us, and it must follow that with a falling demand for labor, not only will the American wage earner, the voting wage earner, lose his job because of that falling demand for labor, but he will also be driven out of other jobs by the newly arrived labor because it is cheaper, and this newly arrived alien labor does not vote. He's again talking about a very valid reason. If you have people that cannot get jobs, that cannot support themselves, why should we be allowing tens of thousands of new immigrants in to compete against that labor force? He's also drilling in the fact that the immigrants coming in don't vote, but the laborers out of jobs do. The next letter is part of an address made by William Williams. And William Williams was actually a commissioner at Ellis Island. He had been appointed by Theodore Roosevelt to make some changes. Ellis Island had been going through some hardships. There had been some controversy involved in Ellis Island. So William Williams had been appointed by Theodore Roosevelt to be commissioner, and he took the scientific view of immigration, and he also believed that too many immigrants were coming in that were unhealthy, that then if they came in, they would be bringing in diseases, and then that would affect the population of the United States. So this is his comments and what he believes needs to be done about immigration. His opinion of intelligent people that altogether too many low-grade aliens are entering this country. In his recent address, Mr. Williams took the position that while immigration as a whole was not undesirable, it contains certain undesirable minority, which should be eliminated. And if he is not mistaken, there will soon be a great outcry against the admission of these people. He is thinking of inviting some of the leading universities to detail a graduate to study economical and other questions in connection with immigrants. So he believes that on the whole, most of the immigrants coming in are okay, but you've got a minority that should not be allowed in, that others believe the same, but he's taking the scientific approach that there should be some studies. What are the economic impacts of having these immigrants come in, and what should be done about them? There is also another letter by Lee Frankel, and he was also part of a commission to look at Ellis Island, and he viewed immigration on a business proposition. So I'm taking the liberty of giving expression to a view regarding the immigration question which may interest you. Viewed solely as a business proposition and aside from any sentimental considerations which may be permissible from the viewpoint of an American, the immigration question is the most important, which confronts us as citizens of the United States with the future welfare of our country at heart. The immigrants who are coming now and those who may come here in the future will be either assets or debts of the states in proportion to their ability to become assimilated. Government is not an automatic affair. Its well-being and growth depend on similar qualities in its citizens. And for this reason, a sound and wise public opinion would dictate not a passive administration of our immigration laws along the lines of weeding out undesirables, but a strong, active propaganda directed to finding the immigrant who will be compatible with our traditions and customs. So he is stating that he believes that we should have an immigrant who's compatible with our traditions and customs, so we have a strong government. So we have another view of this. We looked at economics, we've looked at scientific, and with the health, and now we're looking at our government as being impacted. The second letter that I have, I really just wanted you to look at the head, the letterhead. It's the Chinese Exclusion Commission of California. Not only does, this just tells you that there were a lot of groups, very strong groups, that supported Chinese exclusion. This letter also shows you a challenge of historians, because this man's writing is not easy to read. Very hard, actually. But at the very bottom, what this letter was an appeal to Theodore Roosevelt to sign more exclusions to the Chinese Exclusion Act. At the end, though, it's underlined, it says, "We are at the end of our resources." Now, there were a lot of people that supported the Chinese exclusion, but there were just as many that really questioned our Chinese exclusion, wondered if we were really above this and if it's something that we should be doing. This first cartoon, you have an American missionary talking to a Chinese citizen, and he's stated as the caption at the bottom says, "But why is it," added the thoughtful Chinese, "that I may go to your heaven while I may not go into your country?" The American missionary shrugged his shoulders. That is because there is no labor vote in heaven. So you had missionaries going over to China asking and going and saying that you needed to believe in their same religion, but they wouldn't allow them in your own country. The next image is the skeleton in the closet. If you look at the skeleton, he has the Q. He is a Chinese skeleton. And the placard on him says, "American exclusion of the Chinese." You have Uncle Sam looking at the skeleton in his closet, and his hand says, "Protest against Russian exclusion of Jewish Americans." At the same time that the United States was involved in the Chinese exclusion, they were protesting Russia, who were in the process of excluding Jewish Americans. So again, we have people that really questioned what the United States was doing. Joseph Hawley of Connecticut predicted this about the Chinese Exclusion Act. If this, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 statute, were unearthed 100 years hence, dug out of the dust of ages and forgotten, as it will be except for a line of sneer by some historian, one would not be able to find in law the reason for excluding these men. And that's exactly what you have. We have unearthed the Chinese Exclusion Act. We've unearthed documents, images, cartoons from over 135 years ago. And as we look at these, do we see them with a sneer on our face? Do we see reasons why these Chinese immigrants were excluded? So as we continue with this is the end of the session. Again, this is a rather large, expansive topic. If you are interested in further discussion of this, you can contact me through our website. You can follow us on Facebook or Twitter, and I could share these documents with you or give you more information. Thank you very much.